Malcolm M.K. Palmore. He's an award-winning cybersecurity executive, former FBI agent, Google Cloud director, military veteran, and founder and principal advisor at Apogee Global RMS, a veteran-owned enterprise risk advisory firm. More importantly, he was a U.S. Marine with over 30 years of experience. It's my pleasure to have you to the show. Thanks for joining us, MK.
Hey, Joshua, thanks for having me on the show. And for clarification, that's 30 years total, 30 plus in the U.S. government, 5 of which I was thankful to be a United States Marine.
And that's awesome. And we have very similar background. We served in the same area in Camp Pendleton and El Toro area. And we both ended up doing security and cyber for different companies, right? So, man, I'd love to hear your story. How did you go from the Marine Corps to FBI, Google, and where you're at now?
Yeah, so let me start back in college. So I'm a graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy, entered the Naval Academy in the summer of 1988. And believe it or not, as we're going through the process of trying to identify our majors, I wanted to major in computer science back in 1988. At Annapolis would be too much for me. I was warned about taking on too much. And so I did not major in computer science the way I had intended to. I do my time in the Marines, go directly into the FBI, and midway through my FBI career, because there was and still is so much on the plate of the Bureau in terms of its investigative authority, I was able to raise my hand after having a unique experience with an investigation and transition into the cyber lanes. And the Bureau, at least at the time, and I think still does a phenomenal job of getting folks educated on the areas of investigative authority that they are ultimately responsible for. So I raised my hand for all kinds of courses, certifications, investing in the academic aspects, and of course got my fill of the real world practical application of it through leading one of the largest cybersecurity investigative teams in the FBI based in San Francisco. I did that for the last 6 years of my career. Really just being based in Silicon Valley threw me into the industry, all things tech. And through networking, I retired from government service, go work for Palo Alto Networks as a VP field CISO for a couple of years. And then that matriculated into the opportunity at Google Cloud to help stand up one of their brand new cybersecurity teams at the time, the CISO for cloud, Phil Venables. So I'm one of the plank owners of the office of the CISO. You can just imagine between my FBI experience, time at Palo Alto Networks and Google Cloud, I've been the benefactor of snapshots of everything that's been happening in the technology space and industry for the past decade plus. It's given me a firm footing to establish Apogee Global RMS. That's where I am today, trying to help folks with their transformation efforts.
That's awesome. That's such a colorful background. I got so many questions. Like, what was the day-to-day like in the FBI and cyber side? I mean, is this you working 15-hour days? Is it you're getting off at 8? It just seems like if you haven't been in law enforcement or in the FBI, you really don't understand. The same way nobody really understands what it's like to be a Marine except a Marine.
Right.
And so what was the day-to-day like in the FBI?
Yeah, so the day-to-day in the FBI is unique for each special agent. Depends on what level you're operating at, depends on the violation that you're responsible for investigating. At the time that I really got my deep exposure to cyber, I was actually an executive, so I can't say that I managed the teams that did the work. I didn't have to dig in and do the bulk of the assignment, but what it did in terms of oversight was give me a very, very unique perspective. Most people don't realize the heavy preponderance of intelligence-based duties that the FBI has. And so there's a lot of intelligence collection. So there's the national security component of cybersecurity investigations. And then being here on the ground in Silicon Valley over the past decade, the number of technology and large-scale enterprises that suffered breaches or significant security incidents that required the intervention of the FBI. At the time, it was like being a consultant. You get a snapshot of, unfortunately, some of these enterprises and some of their worst days in terms of their security teams, and you get to see in the postmortem the kinds of lapses in engagement and judgment that organizations make that lead to those kind of foibles in terms of their experiences with cyber. You get to the point where you accumulate quite a bit of knowledge and you get to see these different snapshots of what works and what doesn't work, which has all led to the position that I'm in today. There's no set pattern to what it is that you're engaged in day to day, certainly in the Bureau. When I was a street agent working a variety of matters, each day it's just walking down your cases. You have a portfolio of cases assigned to you, and each day, you got to take each case and move it to the next natural level. And that could be any number of things, to include interviews, drafting court or legal documents to support the case, conducting searches, significant amount of training involved in the day-to-day. And it keeps things super interesting because no week was exactly like the last.
A lot of incidents that I'm in, I don't see law enforcement yet, or it's a bigger thing. And then when you do, you don't hear much from them. There's tons of incidents I know law enforcement doesn't even know about. They never get called about, and corporations handle that themselves. So it's interesting. And then at Google, what was that like, standing up that cloud environment? So I take it's GCP that you were the Google Cloud CISO for. Is that what you were doing there?
Yeah, so I worked for the CISO, who was the first CISO for Google Cloud, Phil Venables.
Phil.
The office of the CISO was his concept and idea, very similar to what you've probably seen by some of the other enterprises. The idea of the field CISO or field CTO is relatively normalized now. But when I went to work for Palo Alto Networks, Rick Howard, who was my boss there, had sort of coined this concept of bringing in technology executives from across different spectrums who could understand the technology and then participate at a very, very high level with customer engagements and evangelism of the products with customers, understanding the challenges, that the practitioners were experiencing, having had, deep experience in a variety of lanes. And so Palo Alto Networks was the first place that I experienced sort of the field CISO environment and exactly what was really necessary to be successful at that role. And then Google Cloud, where at the time, was a distant third in the cloud wars. And now that gap has been closed by quite a bit. And Google Cloud, while I was there, showed its initial first quarter of profitability and now is just going like gangbusters in terms of adoption. And I think as more practitioners and more cloud practitioners take time to understand the GCP environment, they find themselves, in a quandary. There's trade-offs in any cloud environment, and there's some I would say more pros than cons in terms of adoption of GCP. And we were a team that was responsible for helping CISOs get beyond what might be the obstacles to cloud adoption as it relates to security.
No, it's interesting being at that ground level. So I do fractional CISO, and I do security assessments, engineers, very similar. And that background gets you into it. And I noticed when we weren't doing security assessments of GCP because nobody was using them. They would just play environments. And then you used Azure for Active Directory, and you use that for OneDrive and Outlook and all the applications from Microsoft perspective. And then they used AWS for application hosting for major scalability and so forth. So what you're saying is GCP, where it used to be that third place runner, is now moving up and has just as much functionality and capabilities as like Azure would today. Is that what you're saying?
They do. Absolutely comparable. And then, the proposition, again, as we said in our prep conversation, I drank a lot of the Kool-Aid at Google, so folks have to excuse me. The proposition that they make in those conversations is that when comparing apples to apples, that the security that's baked into GCP and a part of the DNA of Google is going to be the thing that's going to be a clear differentiator when evaluating where you're going to go with your cloud workloads. And we did find that to be the case, but helping folks understand what those comparisons look like, because they all three of the major cloud providers use different terminology for the same concepts, and then explaining how GCP might approach a very similar concept that Azure is well known for was a little bit of the challenge. You have to bring the technical teams in and make sure that everyone's speaking on the same terms so that they understand Google's approach, which was zero trust based and zero trust access. It was the new term that was being used. Google was one of the first entities, in fact, pioneers of the zero trust practical application, not just the concept, but actually implementing it in an environment. And so when you're able to show how that has evolved and how it's baked into the solutioning and architecture, it makes for a pretty formidable conversation, which again is why I think you've seen over the course of the past 5 years, Google take a very substantial place within the cloud options, if you were, among the big three.
I think that's great. I always knew they had a good platform. They were just farther behind over the years, and it's great to hear that. And it's coming in more enterprise networks and so forth. I think that's always an advantage. And it does seem just like how we fractionalized applications and services, and you use that in the cloud, like you were talking about before. Expertise is now being fractionalized like never before. People like ourselves, 24, 30 years of experience, going out on our own as independent consultants and seeing that it's not about selling a tool or being in some big consulting shop, but how do you actually get real with customers and have that personal approach, and you're able to bring expertise that is normally not available. And if it is available, it's pretty expensive because Big Four charges like $600 to $700 an hour. So that seems to be the future of just fractionalized expertise, that companies don't have to pay a full salary. They don't have to pay the expense of that, but they can get the benefit and the outcome. What are your thoughts?
I do, absolutely. And as you and I have discussed, we're breathing essentially the same air. I see this as the future of how organizations can really scale and grow their security teams and apparatus. I think that oftentimes, as we both have noted, large scale enterprise is going to be fine. They have the resources, they have the depth of personnel that they can throw at these issues. They usually have the ability to adopt and use the necessary technologies that they need. But the vast majority of businesses are in the SMB market, here in North America. And because those organizations have to compete from a security perspective at the same level as the big folks, they oftentimes, I think, go down a rabbit's hole trying to replicate what these large scale entities can do. You hire the expensive teams, the expensive personnel, they don't quite work out. Trying to build towards something that requires more people that you can invest in. Ultimately, what results is this just mess of tool adoption. People think that you can just go buy the next great tool and stack that onto your technology stack and that you're going to be secure. I think that the firms in the SMB space need to be thinking about fractionalized support to help them build towards something that might be semi-permanent or more permanent. I think they need to be in a position to listen to outside advisors. I think the worst thing a well-functioning SMB can do, attempt to build to the likes of, say, a JP Morgan Chase or some of the larger financial institutions or large healthcare institutions. You'll never be able to match the amount of resources that they can throw at the security challenge. And so why not be thinking about new ways to run down an issue that everyone has to deal with? And I think that's where the fractional support is going to come in. And like you said, folks like you and I with all of these years of experience, I'm starting to see a lot more folks just not opt in to the typical, I want to be a CISO environment. When I first was assigned the leadership role in the Bureau, in the security space, I remember getting out on the market and meeting CISOs from large tech firms. And that was the marquee position, to be a CISO at a large, just massive entity, right? Everyone was working towards that's what they wanted. And so these folks who had kind of been there and done that and had been doing it since the mid-90s, which is when I think the first CISO was established, that was the marquee role. And I think over the past decade, that has diminished quite a bit. I don't think folks want to sign up for one, just a massive responsibility associated with being a CISO of a modern organization today. And still, CISOs are dealing with the challenge of getting the resources and things that they need in order to be appropriately staffed and ready for a potential security incident, because it still has not seen the evolution or the elevation of CISOs to full C-suite responsibilities. They're always baked in under some additional role in the C-suite, like the CIO or CTO. Oftentimes, they're not even a thought for new and developing businesses in terms of bringing on a senior security advisor or a senior security person to build a staff until they find themselves either in trouble or in need of a security person. I just think that this idea of fractional support, as long as folks like you and I can execute well on it and prove that the model works, I think it'll continue to grow. And again, I'm starting to see sitting CISOs opt out of the longer term engagements. They even want to be engaged in this project-based approach to being a CISO. And I think that's the future where we're headed.
Oh, you're absolutely right. I know some pretty powerful CISOs that run on their own now. They're independent. They don't want to go in the rat race. I mean, you interview for these positions, it's burnout. CISO makes it less than 2 years. I think it's 18 months. I was a CISO for Whitney Bank for 7 years. I built that program down in New Orleans. The staff I hired 13 years ago are all there except one person, like 12 of them, which is highly unusual to have all those people there. And then like you would talk about the different in the fractionalization of executives. I think what happens is I generally find 3 types of CISOs, right? Even in the fractionalized world, the ones that just came up from a business background, they have maybe audit experience, they have a business degree, they understand that security is important. They don't understand the technical aspects of it, but they know to contract out with some kind of firm to do that. Or you have, and they handle audits, that's a primary thing, GRC type function.
Right. Yeah.
You have the second type of vCISO who's got an IT background, understands technology and infrastructure, spends a lot of focus on the security operations center or identity access management controls, and knows enough to be dangerous. Or the third type that kind of came up through cybersecurity, pen tester, incident responder. You've done a lot of the assessments and so forth. And so some firms need a technical focused person because the problems that they have rely more on the tech stack and the people that are running it than they do in the risk management functions. They feel that they got the risk management functions under control for the most part, but they do not have the tech side of this. They don't feel they have full EDR coverage. They don't have anyone who can run the program that can speak to the engineers. And they'll feel that the CISO that they have now is too risk management focused and can't relate to the technical staff. And if there's an incident, has to call someone else. Those are the different flavors of CISO. And when it's time for them to have one of those executives, it's either, I see this in a full-time perspective where they want to hire a CISO, the one they had just left. So they need a transitional period, some 3, 4 to 6 months. How can you come in, stabilize the program? And then for step back when the new guy arrives. Or two, is it just strategic uplift of a strategic advisor? Everybody right around Q1, right about this time, is putting together their strategies for the year. If they were proactive, they did it last quarter, but a lot of them are behind. So they're putting their strategies together for 2026. You have to understand what your current state is, your future state, your roadmap, your gap analysis. Takes a lot of work. Some of these CISOs can't do that while running operations. So it makes sense to bring in yourself or other expertise to help pull that information out, figure out what is important, put that strategy together, and then help them build it. It's not a consultant strategy. It was derived together in consultation. So I think that's kind of the benefit of having that fractionalized experience. And then if you do have a CISO that's been one company for 7 years, and then all of a sudden another company for 10 years, and then you hire them, does it really have a lot of experience? I mean, when you're in a fractional model, you're in 5 or 6 different accounts. You're in different verticals. You understand the picture a little bit different. I don't know. What are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. You outlined, I think, a reasonable approximation of the variations of the types of CISO that you will see. The point I wanted to draw the through line or the throughput is that you need different experience for different types of environments and different problem sets. And that's where the idea of fractionalized support and experience comes. One of the things that the discipline I'm trying to develop for my team and I at Apogee is that when we go into an engagement, when you're scoping it out, it's very important to understand where that particular client happens to be in their journey at the moment. And as you aptly noted, then identifying who might be the right person with the appropriate experience to plug into their situation in an interim period that's going to get them to the next stage of where it is that they're moving towards. And that could be very specific, or it could just be from a maturation standpoint, how they're evolving in terms of the security team. So I think it's very important to be thinking about the right person for the right time to achieve the right objectives. And I think that's where the model that you and I are leveraging really comes into play, because you could end up hiring someone, as you indicated, that has that deep technical expertise, but the scenario that they're in requires someone who's much more strategically minded for that particular phase of that organization's maturation. Not everyone is capable of morphing into the type of executive that they need to be for the moment, because organizations are tied to the permanent staff and employees that they have. You're not able to actually make those pivots and make those changes and actually have a security apparatus that evolves with the organization over time. And it's just a use case that I would iterate again and again. It is the reason why organizations should be looking at fractional support for where they are at the moment of their need for that kind of expertise, because hiring someone permanently could work out, but I think there's more vaporware than really substantive capabilities and experience out there. And I think that we get ourselves in a little bit of a challenge circle, because I don't know what your impression has been, but one of the things that I think really hurts the technology space, especially security, is the idea of asking for help. I can't tell you the number of times I've been in front of CISOs, CIOs, and folks who just believe they got all the answers, got it figured out. So they don't want to hear anyone else's advice, because they think that if they take someone else's advice, then it somehow represents a gap in knowledge for them. And they don't want that to be expressed to their employer, because then what do I have you for if you don't know everything? Your
Yeah.
CISO is not supposed to know everything. They need to know who to go to in order to get the company to a point of security, enabling the enterprise, again, during whatever phase it is that they're in terms of their growth and attempts to scale or transform. And I can't tell you the number of times, disappointingly, that I've come across technology leaders who just don't show an appetite for taking in the thoughts and opinions of others. And I think it really, really damages the outcomes of the industry. And I think we see that damage in the ongoing continuous notification of serious security breaches that still are a part of the week-to-week news.
Yeah, no, that's a real good point. And I think it gets a little bit more challenging now when you throw AI on there on top and new technology and how I'm going to use this. I mean, we're doing an AI policy assessment, for instance, for this university. That's what I'm bidding out. And one of it is they just want to have the policy that says a student can use ChatGPT in this manner. The division can do this. This is my policy for acceptable usage, essentially. And this was similar to when the internet first rolled out, the acceptable usage, or where can you go, what's appropriate, and so forth. And we're seeing a lot of companies are like stunned. They don't know what to do with AI. They see these tools. We see people throwing stuff in it. We're seeing data leakage caused by it. But how do I get my arms around it? How do I do that? And that's where I think the strategic person, a CISO, who's got some background, and that makes a whole lot of sense. And somebody that can help bridge some of these newer technologies just from a guidance perspective. I don't think some programs just need a little bit of an uplift and some need a complete reworking, and determining where you're at. Like you were saying, when you go into a customer, knowing what cycle they're at from a business perspective is critical before really determining what their strategy ought to be moving forward.
AI is, there's not a day that goes by now where it doesn't come up in conversation, or you're not dealing with a client that's trying to tackle AI as an issue. I remain bullish on the need for it. I'm excited as a technologist to see it evolve and the types of things that it's going to be capable of accomplishing. I'm a child of the 70s and 80s, so I can't wait to have a robot in my home that's the modern version of C3PO, right? That does everything that you need him to do in the house, take on some of those mundane tasks, but be super intelligent so that you can ask questions and actually accomplish things. With that said, I can't tell you the number of organizations I saw struggle as this thing began to explode onto the scene. Struggle with exactly what you just said. How do we adopt this technology? How do we do it safely and securely? And then how do we measure the ROI of the investment that we made in this is typically the last question that I think is still yet to be determined. Organizations are struggling with it, and they do need help. And there are best practice frameworks that are evolving and have hit the street that you can help folks walk through that will help better enable their adoption of the technology and give them a roadmap as to how to continually assess the impact to the enterprise and whether or not they're doing it in a safe and secure fashion. And oftentimes I think you need outside support to help you walk through those kinds of things unless you have that kind of experience baked into the stakeholders and leaders that are currently in the organization, which you typically do not.
Do not. Yeah. And some companies do not use consulting and they try to hire their own people. I'm concerned too with just the bots' social engineering susceptibility. I had it where a friend of mine was asking Microsoft Copilot at work who's getting laid off, and it told him it had access to the spreadsheets. It was working with HR,
Oh, wow.
so it leaked the information, and of course he sent it to everybody that was at the company for it. So you can see where these chatty bots, they're designed to service, to find information, answer your problem quicker, faster. But you'll notice in like Microsoft Copilot, there's no RBAC model. So it doesn't know, yes, tell the HR director this and the CEO this because they're authorized for that. But anyone else asks, don't answer that or give this response too. It really does not have that contextual. And I'm just seeing a lot of breaches and a lot of things that are outside of people's control within these models. But I can also see where you have agents now, they're doing workflow talking to each other. Well, one's talking to one in London and they use English slightly different. I ran into that. I had a time where I was communicating with one guy and I said in London, I was like, so that's your roommate over there that if you saw walking down the street. I said, so that's your roommate? And he got mad at me. He says, no, that is my flatmate. I'm like, wow, what's the difference? He goes, because roommate means the guy's sleeping in the room with me. A flatmate means there's two rooms and there's a common area. It's like, oh, and The US, we just say roommate doesn't denote whether they're in the same room or not. Now, what happens when you have an agent that's got the same issue? It takes the context of that word differently than you take it in the United States. I don't know, just like we have translational differences now with English across the world, because I've been all around the world and people use different words. I had one guy say, "Excuse me, sir, but can we speak intimate for a moment?" And I was like, "What? What do you mean intimate?" He goes, "Yeah, over here where no one can listen." I said, "Oh, in private? I'll speak in private, but I ain't speaking intimate." I was like, "Why? What is difference? What is context?" What was I supposed to do? I thought he was coming on to me, but no, he wanted to speak privately. So he said, "Can we speak intimately?" And then when we would leave in the meeting, and this is in Saudi Arabia, and he goes, "Excuse me, I must know your eyes got bigger than plates, but do you not speak intimate in the United States?" I said, "Oh, yeah. We speak intimate, except it's usually at night and I'm in bed with my wife when we're doing it." And he freaked out. He was like, "No, that is not the context. That is not the context." So I see those kind of personal, cute things like that, where you learn the difference in words. But what happens when that's an AI agent trying to interpret that and respond back? And there's a workflow that's behind it, accents built into it. Alexa seems to be a problem sometimes with the language. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, no, you just noted, I think, some great examples of things that get lost in translation. I think this will evolve, though. I think those are great examples, and I can see how they might be existing problems, but I think they're going to get worked out fairly quickly. One indicator of this is that even to the surprise of the developers who built these algorithms and the large language models, the models are capable of learning in ways that they had not anticipated. And I think that when we do get to a much more contextualized usage of these models, the location that you're using the model from, the natural language that you speak, the role-based assignment of the limitation of how much, you're building four walls around what you as an individual should have access to. I think the further we go down this pathway, I think we'll eventually get to what you're describing, and it will be able to notice, hey, I have someone from the UK speaking to someone from North America. I need to make sure that I assess and tweak the differences in language use here as we provide information between these two entities. I think that will come over time. It's just a matter of how much of a problem is it now and how far up the chain is it listed on the risk register or the roadmap for the developers that are responsible for tweaking these models. I think we'll get there. I think we'll get there eventually. Yeah. But yeah, those examples I think were excellent.
One of the things you were saying before, I had this experience when I was at EY, and you travel in the country, you're flying all over the place, but I did a board presentation for this insurance company. I think I was in Ohio at the time. And so it was in support of an EY initiative. It was really interesting. They asked me, "Hey, so Josh, how do you know, just coming into a company, talking to a CISO, how would you know if they had a mature program, if they had gaps, if they had, issues?" And I just simply said, well, one red flag I would have is that if you talk to the CISO and all he ever says is anything but, "I have CrowdStrike here, I got McAfee there," and he just starts throwing name brands out and just says, "Oh, I got IBM on the back end." When you just start throwing these brands out that is supposed to give you a persuasion by authority technique, you're supposed to say, "Hey, I got all big blue, how can I get fired?" Then you pretty much know they don't know what they're talking about. So they were interesting to hear that. Well, the CISO was running late for this meeting, and so he comes in like 20 minutes later into the meeting and joins. And they explain why I'm there, and EY is here giving a brief to the board. And, he goes, "Great. I just want to tell you about our program. We have CrowdStrike and I have Splunk." And I mean, he did exactly what I just said. The board, the CFO, everybody just turned looking real upset looking. He just said this. I can't believe it. What my risk registry is. I don't even have all my assets down. I don't even know if there is a cyber attack, who I'm going to call. I don't know. What are some of the red flags you notice when you're talking to someone, whether they really know what they're doing or not?
Well, let's not move off of the example that you just noted so quickly. There's something I want to tease out there that I think has been an evolving challenge for CISOs. And what you just outlined is the challenge of how the role has evolved and how there's been an absence of language associated with business and risk management for CISOs. And this has become a huge topic, I think, probably over the past decade. You see many more certifications and opportunities for CISOs to learn about the language of risk management and to learn to use those terms in business settings, because rattling off a list of tools means absolutely nothing to someone who's sitting on the other side of the table, completely immersed in our industry. Because you mentioned some top names doesn't necessarily have the same impact as you talking about, well, we've evaluated the risk associated to our situation, our enterprise, and here's been our approach to reduce the really high profile risk, get us down to the X number of medium risk, and here's our low profile stuff that we can hold off on. When CISOs learn to adopt risk management as their primary language, I think they tend to do much better in business settings and business space. And I still think that's a challenge. And it goes all the way back to your note at the top of the conversation about that you described 3 different types of CISOs. I have found that I fall into one of those categories that you mentioned, more the audit and GRC type, who's not deeply ensconced in the tech, but I know my limitations. I know when to bring in someone who has that kind of expertise, and I certainly know when to ask for help. I do have a business degree. So on top of that, much more easy for me to then fall into language around risk management and discuss business enabling language more so than technology language, because I've never had the mastery of just the pure tech. I've had to talk in different terms about how to explain issues that we're tackling or how I need to bring in particular expertise to run down an issue. And I think teasing that out as a challenge that still exists in our industry is one of the areas that I've seen evolving. Now, folks are getting better at it, but I think that's why folks like you and I will continue to have jobs at least for the next 5 to 10 years, because it maybe comes to us more naturally than it does for others. And that's what folks need to hear at the board level, at the C-suite level, in order to be able to make prudent decisions about what kind of investments they want to make in security.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And it's speaking the right language. And I know how the board feels. I've been in there where you get a technical presentation and I didn't even really understand. I'm highly technical and I didn't understand what they were saying. It was presented in such a terrible manner. There's no way that executive understood it either. And what you'll notice is that they don't normally say anything. They don't say, hey, I don't know how that works, or what. I mean, they say nothing. Nobody knows what to say.
They think they're not supposed to understand the language, and they assume, oh, this person seems like they're really technically sound. I'm sure they have it in hand until they don't.
Yeah, and I think that's making budgetary decisions as well, right? And when I was at CISO, it was always trying to prove why you needed more spend, or you needed this, or you needed that. The CIO came up to me and asked, hey, how are you getting all your stuff approved? This doesn't make sense. How are you getting budget for this? And I'm struggling. I can't get these servers replaced. I can't get this backup system that I want. How in the hell are you doing it? And it was really about taking the regulatory guidelines at the time, the bank FFIEC guidelines were king. That's what they determined the cybersecurity program should be and how you should have MFA and all this stuff. And so I'd map it to that regulatory guideline and then put a risk paper together saying, these are the risks that we have. This is the compensating control. This is what it's going to be like afterward. And I was able to get budget approved. Rather, before, they would just put it on a spreadsheet and say, under software services, I need another 60K. Under desktop or hardware services, I need another 150K. What for? How does that match to the bigger thing? So I've seen it firsthand. If your approach towards it is how not just the budget, the money you need, but that helps you with the success of your program. If there's a major lift and you don't have the funding to do it and you can't replace older infrastructure, you're kind of dead in the water. You could talk about all the rest you want, but if you couldn't put it together in a coherent strategy in order to get funding for it, you're really not that effective as a CISO. So I guess you see both sides of it. You have to be good at your job, but then you have to be excellent at communicating and to be able to drive outcomes. Is that right?
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. And I think that the example that you just gave is the difference between someone who shows their work and someone who doesn't. You know, we used to have the expression back when you and I were in school to show your work on math problems, right? Using risk and risk registers and risk management actually allows you to show the methodology that you walk through in order to arrive at the decision as to why you need a particular investment to be made. You've shown the value of the investment. You've shown what happens if we don't make this particular investment, or what could happen, whether or not there's a high probability of something happening that's going to impact business. And then the so what is, and this could result in the business being down for a week, a month, in terms of the impact to the organization. And when you're able to show that, it then puts the stakeholder in an easier position to make a decision on whether or not your investment makes sense. If you just give a spreadsheet with a bottom line number, then you're essentially just thrown in with every other ask for financial resources that every other business leader might have within the organization. Being able to show the risk methodology that you use to arrive at the ask that you're making, I think makes for a much more compelling conversation and high probability and likelihood that you're going to get what it is that you're asking for, because you've shown that you've done the math, that you've worked your way to the potential ask, and you're showing potentially in the medium to low level things, the things that you're not asking for this go around, right? So you're showing that you're making decisions based on what the organization needs in the near term.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And I think for the most part is getting the right person in there. Sometimes I think you need to have the right executive recruiting company vet candidates before coming to you. If you're a CEO and you're business minded, you don't really understand technology and everything that's there. When you're interviewing that person, it's more of how they come across, what's kind of their CV say, and so forth.
Yeah.
But in many ways, I find the best positions are from references. Hey, I worked with this guy for 5 years. I know this person's skill set. I know they're perfect for that. That seems to be a lot more often is people's network of good people clobber together instead of just putting out a job rec and let's see who hits. So it does seem like the network's a lot more important than maybe it used to be. You know?
I can't dispute that networks are absolutely important. I think has been the result of the evolution as to how anyone gets great opportunities put in front of them. But what you just outlined is a challenge. Part of what we're tackling at Apogee is that, I have an executive search arm for Apogee, and I have my team from a leadership perspective and an HR perspective trying to figure out a process that will allow us to do much more diligence in the candidates that we're trying to put in front of firms in terms of who's going to work out. I think that oftentimes what you just noted, the references are great, and more often than not, maybe they'll work out for you. But sometimes references don't even hit.
Yeah.
We're biased towards the people we know and trust, and oftentimes we might be advocating for candidates for whom we don't really know what their actual capabilities are. Maybe they just happen to be a nice guy or gal for whom we have a great collegial relationship with, and so we're recommending them for a role. Maybe they look great on paper, but their execution in terms of what they do on the ground is not quite what happens. And then the candidate after 8 months, 18 months doesn't work out, and you see them move on to a new role. I think that is unfortunately the norm. How many times have we seen, to great fanfare, these new hires, high-level hires at the SVP and higher role especially within tech, these companies that come in and maybe it's a sales role, but maybe it's a technically oriented role. All this fanfare around, hey, we're bringing on so-and-so from X firm, and X firm has a great reputation. They come on board over the course of a short period of time, 12 to 18 months. They don't hit the way that they were expected to, don't excel the way they were expected to, and they quietly roll out of those positions, and then they show up 6 months later someplace else, again, to much fanfare. And you got to ask yourself, what happened to the job? I thought you just posted that you were the new SVP of technology for company X, and you're already out of there within 18 months. That's a hiring failure. That is a mistake gone wrong, that over 18 months, you get to actually see that evolve, and then that person walks out, again, for a variety of reasons, leaving little to no impact. That's because the diligence that's necessary to make sure you're getting the right experienced person in these roles is probably not being undertaken. And some of the quote unquote tried and true methods that we historically adhered to, I think we need to redo the deck on that completely.
Yeah, it's a good point. And how you put those right expertise together, and how you're saying in 18 months, that's considered a failure if they're not there anymore. Right. So I think that's, that's interesting. And I think when you look at how do you prepare yourself, like a lot of people ask me, how do you prepare to be a CISO? It seemed to be the gold standard. Like you were saying this earlier, that the gold standard was, I want to build my career to be a CISO one day. And that every kid out of college says that. Been much different. My coming up through the field is I was really technical. I was on a hands-on keyboard. I was building servers and routers and switches and Microsoft MCSE and Cisco systems. And so I was really highly technical for years in IT before going into incident response and security engineering and the other disciplines. And I noticed my background is so much different than the modern day guy. A guy straight out of school has no IT experience, didn't spend years in the IT field, then going into cyber. They go straight into cyber, and maybe that's right into forensics. They take a Security Plus course, or they take a SANS course. they have no real contextual understanding of the greater IT environment, of how it all works and how it goes together. We need to fall over to our backup DR capabilities for the payment processing system. We need to cut off access to Tucson. We need to make these massive decisions that are IT based and they're in protection of the company. That's where I see the fractional model, because there's not a lot of those companies. Usually you have to get the younger consultants. That's how you build them out at a cheaper rate. Holding experienced consultants on the bench, unless you have them going, is costly.
Yeah. Yeah. Just more testament to, the conversation we were having around having the right experienced person for the right moment in terms of your business evolution. Sometimes that's an incident. Other times, maybe it's not, so pressured by time. Maybe you're in a strategic evolution of the business cycle, and you got to have the right input at the right time. If there's anything to be teased from this conversation, is not every background is perfect for the moment. Not every background is perfect for every moment, and that you should take some time to pause and figure out, what do you need for this particular situation? And then once you've got it, that should go through periodic reevaluation. I've always been love the project-based model. I had to take some time to think about this as my career began to evolve. Why I enjoyed certain aspects of being an FBI agent, why I enjoyed the idea of eventually being a consultant out on my own. And it's this idea of a project-based model. And you mentioned this earlier in the conversation. You get so many opportunities to get a snapshot as to how other people are doing it. And that ultimately becomes part of your experience base. You get to see the mistakes without making the mistakes on your own. Oftentimes, it's that outside eye that's necessary to be able to inform decision making. I just think that consultants get a bad rap, right? They're expensive. There are some firms, as you indicated, that don't ever want to hire consultants. They just have this mindset that we'll go out and hire a permanent person before we go hire a consulting firm. And it's unfortunate that the rap exists out there. Yeah, it's such limited thinking. And I think it's about finding the right consultant, the right advisory firm that can get you to the next level.
And then getting that onto a standards framework, having set deliverables and office hours, and having a program structure. A lot of these organizations have a CISO. Doesn't mean he meets with anybody. There's no interaction with some of the employees or the staff. In a virtual CISO framework, you put a program together for the year and you have those office hours, and leadership can join those office hours where the part of the business just has questions on how security is going to do this in the future or whatever. They don't have to put a formalized ticket in. So I think being closer to the business in the different participants. And instead of being in a fractional role, you're only working for the CIO or you only uplift in that manner. I love it when you're in a role where they allow you to spread out to the organization and have kind of that office hour approach towards risk management in the organization, because it just doesn't come out formalized. The CISO doesn't write something and then all of a sudden the tablets come down from the sky and then everybody knows it. Even when policy changes, that doesn't mean everybody knows it or it's enforced everywhere. It's a real challenge in today's environment.
And I think that our field doesn't necessarily attract folks who are thinking about it in terms of both the level of influence that they have and the leadership skills that you need to develop when you're managing and leading large scale programs. What you just indicated about a CISO who's not having conversations with people or meeting with folks, like that should just be a normal part of the evolution of any leader in any organization. Take time to calendar time with folks who are not in your direct line of sight, because that's the only way that you're really going to understand what's happening in the rest of the organization. And it doesn't have to be some significant lift. A 15-minute conversation can yield all kinds of information if you create the space necessary for folks to feel like they can convey opinions. And it doesn't mean you have to act on everything that you hear, but if you string together a couple of conversations with folks who are not direct reports of you that tell you that there's a gap in between what they're hearing at their level and what you think is happening in the organization, then you have a problem that you need to
listen
fix.
to it. Yeah. Same thing. And one thing about the Marine Corps I loved is the leadership training they put us through, right? Best leadership training program around. And when you say you have multiple fathers, coming from the enlisted side versus the officer side, I know you probably have a different experience in your relationship to instructors, right? Versus our drill instructors. But you could see where you had a lot of father figures, from the 23-year-old, 24-year-old drill instructor to your first platoon commander to your squad leaders and so forth. You started to have these men that cared about your better benefit and wanted to pour into you and wanted to see you be better. And it's just being in an organization where excellence was demanded of you constantly and it was constantly pushed. And you don't have that in the civilian world. You don't have people with the same kind of responsibility and to say, okay, that is troop welfare. Let me make sure I'm communicating down before I do this. It just doesn't seem those principles exist a lot anymore.
What you just described is one of the reasons why I've always wanted to strike off on my own and create my own culture that's based upon some of those great experiences that I've had, some of the great leadership that I've seen and been a benefactor of. When you create a culture, if there's a problem there, that's your responsibility to fix it. As I think about growing a business, I have a workforce of 10 or less people right now. At some point, maybe it'll be 20 to 25 people. At what point do I need to worry about whether or not the organization is getting too big? Am I out of touch with certain elements of the organization?
Fractional guy to help you out.
Yeah, and we used to talk a lot in the business world about at what size does the organization get to the point where the leader is not as effective as they possibly could be. We now have these behemoth organizations and enterprises on the planet, and they claim to be interested in what's happening from a leadership standpoint, but have yet to see or hear about large-scale organizations that have been able to tackle the problem of just sheer size and scale, and how you create a culture of leadership that does promote the idea of pouring into and investing in the people so that you can get to the end zone of productivity and high revenue generation. How many times have you seen an organization that's not meeting its numbers say, maybe we have a leadership problem? It's not just about firing people and getting the next man or woman up into some high-level role. It's about whether or not you've created a culture of leadership that's going to allow you to grow in the way that you expect to grow. Leadership should be among the top things that every organization is thinking about each year. How do we build and grow better leaders in our organization? Because that will absolutely ensure your success.
Yeah, and the longevity and the turnover. I mean, you just put it from a business perspective with HR. I think you can measure leadership and churn and really make some decisions on that.
Yeah.
MK, it is great talking today. I feel we can go on for hours. How do we get in touch with you? How do we follow you? I know you're at Apogee Global RMS, but how's the best way to follow what you're doing over there?
Yeah, LinkedIn's probably the best and first model. If folks reach out to me directly on LinkedIn, happy to make the connection. I post rather prolifically on there, both my thoughts about leadership, but also my insights around the technology space and what we're seeing from an advisory standpoint. So that's easily the best model. And of course, you can go to apogeeglobalrms.io, which is the website, and see what we're doing from a company profile.
Well, excellent. Well, this was a great podcast. I had a great time talking to MK. Everybody else, please hit that like, that subscribe button, put some comments. You got any questions we'll make sure to respond to them. But thanks for everybody's time and stay secure.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Cybersecurity America. Until next week, stay secure.